So I work in the world of defense and government contracting quite a bit. A lot of the customers that I work with are in that space. And in that world, earned value management is a common requirement. And often when I work with people that are trying to adopt Agile, they'll say, well, we can't do Agile because we have earned value. We have to report earned value. And there is a connection, a very direct connection, historical, as well as some of the detailed requirements between waterfall and earned value. So when they tell me we can't do Agile because we have earned value, I say, wait, let me show you. Usually when I give this presentation, it's to people that know a lot about earned value and know almost nothing about Agile, although they have a lot of perceptions about what Agile is. And for today, I had to turn it around, which is kind of an interesting experience, because I assume that you know a lot about Agile. I know that you do. And you probably know very little about earned value, or at least I made that assumption. So if you know a lot about earned value, bear with me for just a minute, because I want to try to describe it to you so that you can understand some of the issues. And I'll point out some specific areas that are problematic. Earned value has been around long enough that it's actually been standardized by the ANSI. That's a danger sign right there. Anything that's been standardized, you know it's going to be difficult. It's also, the DoD has their own sort of version of it, but they're so close together that we can just consider it one for our purposes. There's tons of jargon, so it's very difficult to understand, like many standards are. And also, a little counterintuitively, all the units are in dollars or cost. So even when we talk about schedule performance is in dollars. So we'll look at that in just a minute. For government contracts over $20 million, it's actually required by law. Not that there aren't plenty of exceptions to that, but in general, people who are interested in fulfilling services for the government or producing new capability for the government and costs more than $20 million, they're going to be faced with this. And other industries use it as well. You'll see it sometimes in the finance world or other areas where they're very concerned about governance, which I equate with low trust. Which says that I don't believe you're going to deliver what you say, so I'm going to make sure that I measure you very, very carefully.
Or trying to constrain risk.
Constraining a risk. And that's really what this is. If you're going to spend $20 million on something, you might want to make sure you get something in return. Might be a good idea. Luckily for the government, they're spending other people's money. So has a different kind of a constraint. So very quickly, what earned value looks like, and there's actually a standard gold card out. You can find it on the internet. For those of you that want to study this further, or not, you create a baseline plan. That's unintuitively called the budgeted cost of work scheduled. Everybody can write that down? Budget of no, don't write that down. BCWS. This is how you're going to spend the money over time, and it's also how you're going to deliver what you say over time in the sense of schedule. So as time flows, I should be able to measure how much cost I've expended, and I should be able to understand how much, therefore, work I've delivered or work I've completed. And then, of course, I can predict for the future. So I've got a budget that I'm shooting for in terms of dollars, and I have a time. Pretty simple. That's pretty easy. As you're going along in your project and you're measuring it, and you're taking quote-unquote earned value, you have to measure what's actually happened. And you first start with your cost, which of course is the obvious actual cost of work performed. I'm sure that was intuitive for you. So whatever date, you've expended some cost over time, and you also measure how much work is performed. That's the blue line, which of course is BCWP. That's the budgeted cost of work performed. Yeah. I knew you knew that, but I just wanted to jump to that. Now you can predict, based on history or by any other means really, what it's going to take to finish, and by looking at where you are, you can look at, I was supposed to complete a certain amount of work, but I only completed some other amount of work, or maybe I completed more work. You have a variance. In this case, it's a schedule variance. And if there's any variance, positive or negative, in the earned value world, you get to explain why. You'd think if you were above the line, you wouldn't have to explain it, but in earned value you do. Because it says you weren't good at predicting the future. So there must be something wrong with your prediction. So you better explain it, whether it's good or bad. That's the world you get to live in here. Now, in addition to having a variance in schedule, you might have a variance in cost. And this isn't a budget variance. It's a variance in how much it cost you to accomplish the work that you did finish. That's your cost variance. So it's not against the black line for cost variance. It's against the work that you finished. So that's a little bit counterintuitive, perhaps. And of course, you can predict how long it's going to take, as we're used to talking about, to complete all of the work, which of course is defined at the very front of the project. And you might say that it's going to take you longer or perhaps less time. And given that, you can predict the cost and how much it's going to cost you at the completion. Okay? So that's a very, very high-level view of earned value and how it works from day to day. These terms are very complicated, and you can use just very simple terminology. Look, there's a baseline plan, there are actual costs, and there's actual tasks, actual work completed. That's really what they're looking for. So from that perspective, that's not terribly different from what we're trying to do in terms of making a prediction about where we're going. And I usually present this because this is a great example of the contrast between Agile, or Scrum in particular, and earned value. You know this perfectly well, so I don't have to go over it, but really the right-hand side of this is where earned value comes from. We want to have lots of plans that we're going to follow. We're going to negotiate a contract. Lots of emphasis on process and tools, and then try to ensure your performance in a given program. And of course, in the Scrum world, we really want to value the left-hand side of this. We're going to have the right-hand side. That's all well and good. But we know that we get more value, or we can deliver better value off the left-hand side. So this helps to sort of point out, at least at a very high level. Usually I can go through then and talk about some very specific conflicts between earned value world and the Scrum world. In the earned value world, we always want known requirements negotiated up front, and we pre-plan the task to the end of the period, whatever that is. That's how we can establish our baseline. Of course, in Scrum, we're focused mostly on uncertain requirements, at least at some level, and we rely, of course, on frequent inspection and adaptation. So we don't want the pre-planned up front. We want to make sure we can adapt as we go. In earned value, all the tasks are approved by the customer at the beginning of the program. In Scrum, the team identifies or uncovers and discovers the work as we go, from sprint to sprint. In earned value, if we have significant changes in the requirements, significant meaning it's going to dramatically impact the cost baseline or the schedule baseline, we have a contract negotiation, i.e. the right-hand side of the manifesto. In the Scrum world, of course, we discover new things. We just add it to the amount of work to be done. So maybe we trade off. What a great idea. In earned value, we have reporting that's required, again, of actuals, and we have cost measurement and reporting. The focus very much on that chart that I showed at the beginning is on what we have done in the past. There's an incidental discussion about where we're going to finish, but the focus is on what we've done. In Scrum, of course, our focus is on, really we try to focus on what remains, and we look at that every day and at the end of every sprint, which might only be a couple of weeks. So earned value only inspects the history at a much less frequent period. In earned value, if you've got any variation from your plan, you have to have an analysis and a justification for it. And of course, in Scrum, if we don't have any completed work, it just rolls over into some future sprint. So there's quite a bit of conflict between these two worlds. If you look out on the internet, you'll start to see a few articles in the last couple of years about Agile and earned value. And some people feel there's a lot of synergy, and they start out from that perspective. It's sometimes helpful to start out from what the differences are so that we can try to derive how we could make adjustments on both sides. And that's really where this work is focused, is how can we make some adjustments on both sides of the equation to try to be able to have these big contracts with the government, which can be quite lucrative, but at the same time get the value of Agile and Scrum. So there are a couple of adaptations that we can make. First of all, on the earned value side, of course, we don't want to pre-plan all of our tasks. Right? We know that's going to be a disaster. We're not going to be accurate. But we can pre-plan all of the sprints. We can say that the sprints are a certain length. They're going to have a start date and an end date. And when I finish one sprint, I'm going to go to the next sprint. That's pretty straightforward. It requires, on the earned value side, that we only plan the sprints and not the tasks. That's an adjustment, and the people who enforce earned value will have lots of questions about that. Because you need to understand how much work goes into these different blocks of effort. So to help accommodate that, there's an adjustment or an accommodation on the Scrum side, which is that you need to really have an estimate of the totality of the work. So this is a big adjustment for Scrum. But by doing that and planning a velocity curve that we think is achievable based on what we know today, then we can say that we can achieve a certain amount of work. It's not specific tasks. We don't know what work it is out here in Sprint 4, but we can say that we're going to try to achieve a certain amount of work. Now, of course, the counter argument is, but what happens when we have change? And the answer is, it's the same problem you're going to have in the more traditional approach of earned value, except that we have some more flexibility. If you have new requirements that you discover, we have now the flexibility to remove 10 points here and put 10 points there. In the traditional approach, we have to have a contract negotiation to achieve that. So at least we get that capability that we didn't have before in the more waterfall or traditional earned value approach. But we do have to establish some kind of baseline, and so that's the hard part we have to work on. And how do we do that? The way that I've been able to do this successfully in the past is that, first of all, you have to get the key stakeholders to agree. Usually there's a customer involved or perhaps an internal governing body. They're going to have to agree that you're not going to pre-plan tasks, you're only going to pre-plan sprints, and that you're going to estimate the amount of work accomplished per sprint in points or however you're going to measure that on your product backlog. You have to try to develop an initial product backlog. That means you can't have completely unknown requirements. You have to have some idea of what you're trying to deliver. Have a lot of brainstorming sessions with people. There's, of course, time to establish your baseline at the beginning of the program. And so you can create this product backlog, and as we know, that'll have priority and it'll have estimated effort in points. We can lay then those points out across the different sprints, and that really establishes how much work burn down we'll have over the life of the particular period. So that helps us establish our baseline. From that, of course, in most software projects, it's primarily labor-driven. Even if you have subcontractors, it tends to be labor-driven, and you can drive your cost baseline knowing what your rates are and that kind of thing. So if in sprint 1, you can look at how many people you're going to have work on it, etc., over your sprints to establish a cost baseline. And then, of course, communication with your stakeholders is pretty critical. So those steps are pretty fairly straightforward, although there are some differences from the way we traditionally work. When you have to report this up to the key stakeholders, what does that look like? Because the traditional burn-up chart for earned value has some problems with it, although it could be usable. And so something that might look like this. The reason I do it this way is that I can use a more traditional approach from the Scrum world with the team, and then use the same vehicle with some additional information to communicate with management. So I'm not creating two divergent things. It looks like kind of look like you're cooking the books. So we want to try to avoid that. So, and I prefer burn down charts personally because I like looking at when we're going to be finished, and I think it shows that better. So first, of course, we start with a plan. It doesn't look dramatically different than a release plan, except that we've got this baseline of points per sprint that we're burning down. Okay, there's this velocity goal, if you will. Communicating it as a goal is really important because if you have to communicate it as the required number of points, then we're screwed. Okay, that's the danger of this approach. But if you want that $25 million contract that requires earned value, it's one of the discussions that you have with the stakeholders. Okay, and then of course you track it over time. You show the amount of work completed. I have obviously a very simplified diagram. You might have new requirements coming in, old requirements becoming obsolete. I'm not worried about that level of detail here. But we continue to estimate the work remaining for the release or for the project. And we can show that as our schedule line. And of course, we can look at a variance where we are versus the plan. Of course, because we're using Scrum, we're ahead of plan. You might notice that subtlety. Obviously, if there was more remaining work, we'd still have our variance reports that we have to worry about, but that's something we want to keep away from the team. The team shouldn't have to worry about any of that junk. That's something that project management would work on separately. And of course, we can try to do a forecast with all of its. I showed a single line. Of course, typically we'd rather see a range. Even if you show a range in earned value, you're going to have to pick a number in that range. So that's an issue with earned value that you're going to have to deal with. Now this is what the team can use, and you can continue to look at this from a schedule performance. We can start to communicate with the management, but we want to keep that separate. So keep Scrum with Scrum and earned value with earned value by adding a cost curve. So we have to change the percentages to do that. So you had 100% of the points, you got points burned off as a percentage. That works okay. Cost as 100% of your budget, how much budget remains? So of course, not only are we ahead of schedule, but we're under budget because we're using Scrum. Wherever you are at a given point in time, you can look at your cost variance. And again, you would report it from EVM against your schedule completion. And you can predict your completion, how much budget remains. Of course, if you're over budget, the green would be below the black line, and you'd finish on the negative side of the chart in that case. Now you have to translate the words from the team into earned value words, and you can report it out in earned value. But by following steps like that, it is possible to still achieve the vast majority of the benefit of Agile with an ability to trade off priority and work within the period, and yet still achieve the reporting requirements that EVM requires. Thank you.